It's time to go through one of the new books by Dr. David Jeremiah of the year 2022, the book of Signs. I want to go through some of these chapters with some of my comments. On verse 7, he says, according to the Bible, the regathering of the Jewish people back to their homeland is predicted time and time again as a precursor to the end times. Well, those prophecies in the Old Testament about the regathering of Israel and Judah, not just Judah, Israel and Judah, those context of those passages are to do indeed with the very time of the coming of the Messiah. Because as I've told you before, in Bible prophecy, the house of Israel and the house of Judah are in a state of captivity to their enemies when the Messiah returns, and the Messiah will bring them out from their enemies and indeed restore them to the Holy Land. And so that is the context of those passages that these fundamental prophets often get mixed up with things that have been happening, in the 20th century. The context, as I've said before, is very important in Bible reading and Bible understanding. He goes on to say, we are also told that the consolidation of world power under a supreme leader in Europe is one of the essential preludes to the coming of the Antichrist. Well, let me say again, there is never going to be a power on this earth before the coming of the Messiah that is going to rule the whole globe. This so-called Antichrist that is to come, indeed the false prophet of the book of Revelation, is never ever going to rule the whole world. This false prophet, this Antichrist, is going indeed to rule the Western world, but he is not going to rule the Eastern world. And that's again what many of these fundamental prophets get all mixed up. And they talk about this one world ruler that will rule the whole world. No, this Antichrist, this false prophet, and this beast power, yes, of Europe, as Jeremiah says here, of Europe, will rule the Western world, but it will never ever rule all of the world. Continuing, he says, the prophet Ezekiel speaks of a day when Russia will lead an alliance of nations that will attack Israel, igniting a pivotal world war like none ever seen or imagined. And again, these fundamental prophets, they're going to the book of Ezekiel 38 and 39, and they're putting it before the Messiah returns. As I said to you before in my YouTubes and gone through it in detail with you, chapter 38 and 39 of the book of Ezekiel is going to take place after Israel and Judah have been brought out of their captivity by the Messiah, and they're dwelling in the Holy Land, and they're now prosperous and without gates and bars. There's no person or people that are ever going to make them afraid anymore, because the Messiah will be living with them. That prophecy of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is after the coming of Jesus Christ. And then Jeremiah goes on to say that there's going to, during the tribulation period, we can expect the financial world order to be located in a city called Babylon. Now, in another chapter, he talks about Babylon. He believes that it is the Babylon over there in the Middle East, in Iraq. I mean, it's one of the most silly and crazy ideas that Babylon over there is going to somehow mushroom to world power again. The Babylon the Bible speaks about in Revelation 17 and 18 as the Old Testament commentaries of Protestantism, Albert Barnes, Matthew Henry, Adam Clarke, and others, Jefferson, Fawcett, and Brown, most of those commentaries will plainly tell you that the Babylon of the end time is going to be the power that indeed that is situated around Rome, because the woman that rides the beast is going to be the church from Rome. And so the Babylon of end time Bible prophecy has got nothing to do with the Babylon of Iraq. And that's all I'll finish on reading that little part. He goes into Israel, the Abrahamic covenant, national covenant, the personal covenant. He goes into all the covenants and stuff of Abraham, the universal covenant, an eternal covenant. And then he says, why did God choose Israel on page 12? He says at the bottom of the paragraph, then why did God choose the Jews? The answer, because it was his sovereign purpose to do so. Well, that's true. It was the sovereign purpose of God to do so. But Deuteronomy chapter 4 tells you the specific reason why the eternal God chose the people of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, so they would be under his government and be a light to the world. They would show the glory of having the true God as their leader and their king, living according to his laws and ways, and they would be so prosperous and wonderful that other nations would say, we want to know about this God. Let us go and learn about this God. We want this God of Israel to also be our God. That's why God chose the 12 tribes of Israel. And then the return to Israel. He says, what people are really asking is this. Now that Israel is restored, well, the Jews are restored to its land, is this the end? And he goes on to say, many assume it is. But I have to tell you then that the answer is no. What is happening in Israel today, the state of Israel, is primarily the result of a secular Zionist movement. Whereas Ezekiel wrote about the spiritual return of God's people to him. And David Jeremiah quotes from Ezekiel chapter 34. And part of that is, I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you'll keep my judgments and do them. Then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. Well, again, this is a future prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, when that will be true, when Israel and Judah will be in the Holy Land. The Messiah will be among them, and they will have God's Spirit poured out upon them. It's also the prophecy of Zechariah 12, verse 10. I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on me whom they have pierced. A prophecy of the coming of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, when that will happen, indeed, when Christ returns. He goes on to say on page 13, this gives an assurance that full restitution is on the horizon, and the prophecies concerning Israel's return to God will also be fulfilled, and it will. And I've showed you that on many of my YouTubes. I've showed you the wonderful prophecies when Israel and Judah indeed will be one people, one nation again, one people of 12 tribes, and they will have God's Spirit. And we will have that millennium, or that 1,000 age will indeed come to this earth with Jesus Christ when he returns, the resurrection taking place, and indeed then the King of Kings and Lord of Lords of the earth will be Jesus Christ. On page 14, he says, the Jewish people have survived by remaining vigilant, but they long for peace. According to the Bible, a figure leader will fulfill this longing by bringing a peace deal with Israel's enemies. Now he's going to go into Daniel chapter 12, Daniel chapter 9, here, which is all wrong. But scripture also tells us that this peace plan will be broken and Israel will be attacked once again, this time as never before. Countless enemies will mass against the boxed-in nation, leaving it with no human hope of victory. Only Christ's return, his judgment, and his reign will finally bring true peace to Israel. Well, they're going into this Daniel 9 business of 7 years. This Antichrist will make a peace treaty with the Jews, but in the middle of this 7 years it will be broken, and in any case there'll be desolation upon the Jews. Now it is very true. Luke chapter 21 tells you, verse 20, 21, and the context, that indeed at the end time, Judah over there in Palestine, in the Holy Land, will indeed be invaded and will indeed go under persecution again at the end time. But that's the Jewish people. It will happen in the Holy Land. It will take place. There will be a persecution upon Jewish people again. But also the Bible shows that, as I brought out in many videos to you, that the house of Israel will also go under persecution by this beast power of Europe, will go under persecution. And indeed, those nations of the house of Israel, as I mentioned to you in the past, and the house of Judah will go into captivity by the beast power of Europe. And so, he talks then about Europe. Daniel's interpretation, he talks about the great prophecy of Daniel and the great figure of Daniel that most people know. You know, the head is Babylon and so forth, and the legs and the feet are Rome. And he goes into that then in this next chapter. Comes along in Daniel's intense dream, rebirth of the Roman Empire, reinforcement of the European government, indeed renewed vigilance, the consolidation of world power. He says here, since the time of the Roman Empire, there have been no nation or empire with the power to govern the known world. But it is coming. In the future, the world will be unified under one dominant leader. No, it will not. That dominant leader will never, ever rule the Eastern world. That dominant leader and that power of Europe, the resurrected Holy Roman Empire, the seventh resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire, will only rule the Western world. It will never rule the Eastern world. He goes on to say, today the concentration of power in the European Union signals the beginning of this new world order. No, it will not be a world order. It will be a Western world order. But it will never, this power rising in Europe, and with a church riding it, the church indeed that has its headquarters in Rome, will rule the Western world, but it will never rule the Eastern world. He goes on under a heading here about a coming world leader and says, the leader will emerge from the group of 10 to take control of the European coalition. Well, that leader will come from Europe and become the final world dictator. No, it will be the Western world dictator. We know him, excuse me, we know him as the Antichrist. We must not miss this point. The European Union is a prelude to the coming of the Antichrist. Well, the Antichrist, the false prophet of the book of Revelation, will indeed be from Europe. And this will be the end time, indeed, beast power. On page 28, he says, Daniel's prophecy tells of a treaty that will be signed between the Jewish people. Well, he goes into this Daniel chapter 9 again. This treaty that will be signed with the Jews. No, there's no need for a treaty with the Jews. The Jews are quite capable with their armament to defend themselves. They will not even dream about having some kind of a deal with Europe, a 7-year deal with Europe, and then broken in the midst of it. It's all again of this false teaching of Daniel chapter 9 that started with Schofield at the beginning of the 20th century in his Bible. And he came up with this interpretation of Daniel chapter 9. It's completely false, as I've said to you before. Look in the Bible commentaries again of Protestants, Albert Barnes especially, detailed explanation of the true understanding of Daniel chapter 9.